This is The Origins of Humankind by On Humans and CARTA with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And in this series we've brought together some of the world's leading experts to piece together the shared origin story of us all. And today is the end of the journey, a journey that has taken us from the origin of life to the rise of an unusual ape whose descendants evolved big brains, small teeth, slim bellies, and an oddly social way of living. We've traced the rise of a peculiar form of this creature, Homo sapiens, tracing the footsteps of our ancestors as they spread around the world to high mountains, dry deserts, deep into the Arctic and the Amazonian jungle, eventually persisting as the sole survivors of the human family. Long gone are the Neanderthals, the Flores hobbits, and the Homolongi, the dragonmen of China. And in that sense, we could say that the origins of humankind in any shape or form has come to an end. But instead of stopping here, we're going to have one more episode, an epilogue, looking at what happened next. My guest today, again, is the director of the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, Professor Johannes Krause. And with him, we are going to take this flyover tour over the so-called Holocene of the last 10 or so thousand years. We're going to talk about the Neolithic Revolution, the spread of farming. We're going to end knocking at the doorsteps of modernity with some final thoughts about a very particular moment in the human story. During this tour, we're going to touch upon some of the big questions in the broad contours of history, from the origins of inequality to the less appreciated but equally fascinating question about why have the grasslands, the steppe between Europe and China, produced so much, not just the Mongolian Empire, but so much of world history altogether. I hope that you enjoy this tour. If you do, definitely check out the other episodes of The Origins of Humankind. There's 4 of them from the past 4 weeks with some really amazing guests. I've had great fun doing this. I've learned so much doing this. And I want to say that it's been a big pleasure to see how incredibly popular the series has also been amongst listeners. Just last week's episode has already, in 1 week, become the single most listened to episode in the history of On Humans. I have received messages from top-tier academics telling me that they are using or planning to use the material in teaching. So clearly something has gone right in this. I couldn't have done this alone. The series is co-produced with the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropology, UC San Diego. Warm thank you to everyone at CARTA, especially Professor Pascal Gagneux and Jesse Robin, who have collaborated with me in organizing all of these talks. Thank you to all of you listeners who have made it a worthwhile endeavor for us to do this. And of course, thank you so much to all my Patreon supporters for all the support that you've shown me, not only now, but throughout the years. It's been really wonderful to have this little wind in the sails as I've been sailing forward with the show. So as always, this episode is for you, and whoever you are, wherever you are, if you're running on a treadmill, running errands, doing the dishes, commuting to work, or just wanting to learn about our peculiar species. Thanks for tuning in, and let's go one more time with Johannes Krause. Professor Johannes Krause, welcome back to On Humans.
Pleasure to be here.
Last time, we tried our best to cover the first half in the story of us, of modern humans, Homo sapiens. So the big picture is that we come from Africa. That's pretty well established, beyond reasonable doubt. We don't leave Africa once, but many times. But many of these attempts become dead ends. And then there's the mega successful exodus somewhere between, let's say, 70 to 50,000 years ago. There is a departure and there's a spread and expansion. And by the end of the ice ages, we are really not only inhabiting basically all habitable corners of the earth from Australia to the Americas, but we are also the only human species left. We've met our famous cousins, the Neanderthals. We've met the less famous cousins, the Denisovans, who you were very much responsible of discovering. They are all gone, and the ice ages come to an end around a bit over 10,000 years ago. And with that, we have warm and wet weathers of the so-called Holocene. And with the new weathers, we also have new lifestyles emerging: farming, shepherding, pastoralism, all of these things. And of course, almost literally, we could say the rest is history. So how is this for a summary of the Pleistocene epoch, the beginning of the Holocene?
That is perfect. So the only correction I would say is that the out of Africa is maybe about 47, 48, but I wouldn't really push it back to like 60 or 70,000 years ago, because there's one event, this Neanderthal admixture, that all people outside Africa have. So all people outside Africa have this about 2 to 3% Neanderthal ancestry, which comes from one major admixture event that we now know happened 47,000 years ago. So this could be basically the point in time when people then expanded into Europe, Asia, Australia. So it's pretty well dated now. So, meaning also everything that is older than 50,000 years and is connected to modern humans, some archaeology, some human remains that are found outside Africa that are older than 50,000 years, they're coming from extinct human populations. They cannot be part of the genetic diversity that we know today outside Africa because they all have the Neanderthal ancestry. And as that was only 47,000 years ago, which is much younger than a lot of people thought. Like I said, 50 to 70 is something what a lot of people might have said. But now we actually know because we have those individuals, those really, really old genomes that lived just 50 to 80 generations after the admixture. They still have really long chunks of Neanderthal DNA. So less than 50,000 years ago.
But this is great. We have a very easy to remember date, 50,000 years ago. A little bit after that, there is a human population somewhere who has had a mixture with Neanderthals, basically has sex with Neanderthals. And all humans alive, especially at least outside of Africa, are coming from that source population.
Exactly.
And of course, those genes have also flowed back into Africa, probably important to say.
Yes. Starting around 20,000 years ago, we have people coming back to Africa, mixing with lineages there. We just published a paper yesterday, in fact.
Oh, really? Okay.
On a lineage in Africa from the Green Sahara. We might come to that anyway.
Yes, the time when the Sahara was green and lush. Yes.
It's incredible. Something I didn't know before I kind of started working in this area and time period, that between 15,000 years ago and about 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. It was a savanna with lots of lakes. And we now have the first genomes from there. And actually, it happens that those genomes are from a branch that is kind of on the out of Africa. So it is closer related to Europeans and Asians compared to sub-Saharan Africans. But it does not have the Neanderthal admixture. It's actually the people that stayed behind. And this is basically this population that stayed in Africa, that lived in North Africa, we think, 50,000 years ago. And this population survived in this part of the world until at least 7,000 years ago, maybe until 5,000 years ago, because then it becomes too dry and the place is becoming a desert again. And we were really surprised to find them.
And do these people pretty much die out, or has their genes just kind of spread?
Here, I mean, they are mixed in because they were present all over North Africa, we think. They're mixed into other parts of North Africa. Then all the North African genomes have mixture from Europe or from the Near East. So they have a little bit of African, but also then kind of a substantial amount of admixture from outside Africa. But this population that we now have does not have that. That's the African lineage. That's actually what is mixed into the other ones. That's the population was present in North Africa before people came back into Africa.
So that's kind of a root North African population that used to live on the lush Sahara that then later mix with migrants who come back from Asia and Europe.
Yes.
To form the North African before, I guess, the Arab invasion. So the Amazigh, the Berbers.
Exactly. That's where it would be highest today. So they have the highest ancestry of that time.
But this is very interesting, by the way, because before we zoom back out into the big picture, now that we are on this lush Sahara, I have heard from not such reputable sources, I have heard a very, I think, enticing suggestion, which is that when the Sahara dried out, people from the Sahara had to find a new place to move, and they would move into the Nile Valley. And they would become the ancient Egyptians. Am I hearing right that the genetics doesn't support quite as neat of a story on that period?
Right, the opposite. We have now, and now we are in Africa, and I think we should remain there because it's where we came from. So I think it's probably also where we should start.
Yeah, and it's so often lost in the stories. Like, oh, we came there and then we left. We didn't really leave. I mean, some of us, but is it like humanity left Africa? Yeah.
Yes, actually, much more genetic diversity of humans stayed behind. Actually, just the branch of the kind of big tree left. And most of the tree is still there, many different branches. There's much more genetic diversity in Africa today than anywhere else in the world because people outside Africa are just part of that diversity. And we have genomes from ancient Egypt. It's just a handful of genomes that we have currently. From different time periods, it's mostly kind of first millennium BCE until the Roman time. And those genomes, all that we have so far, look genetically like people from the Near East. They have zero sub-Saharan African ancestry, and they also don't have the ancestry I just described from the Green Sahara. So they don't really have a strong African component. They mostly look genetically connected to populations that we have in the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age and earlier time periods, like basically over 5 to 10,000 years in the Near East. So probably because they're connected to the Near East, so it seems to be more that this population formed basically a connection between the Nile Valley and the Near East over a period of several thousand years. and is probably exchanging genes for a very long time because it's a neighboring region, right? It makes a lot of sense. I mean, the Sinai Peninsula just connects the Near East with Egypt, and we don't really seem to see much connections at all to North Africa, and also not to the Green Sahara genomes that we now have. So the ancient Egyptians seem to be more connected to the Near East than they are to Sub-Saharan Africa or kind of the original North African.
So the ancient Egypt is more like an annex of ancient Mesopotamia than an annex of ancient Sub-Saharan Africa.
At least for when we have data, which is something like for the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, it's possible that before the dynastic period, so the time before the pyramids were built, this was different, but then there was a population replacement, which is also possible, but we don't have that data yet. So it's surprisingly hard to get data from ancient Egypt, even though, everyone knows the famous Egyptian mummies, and there's tons of them. They have been collected by lots of collectors in the 19th, 20th century.
Oh, we have quite a few of them in London.
They're everywhere. I mean, it's crazy because it was, there were even societies in the 19th century that did mummy parties where they unwrapped the mummy together. And there was also a lot of fake mummies at the time because it was so popular that people were just like exhuming bodies from cemeteries and then just wrapping them and then shipping them to kind of various places because it was such a, funny and quotation marks activity to some people. But no DNA, it's not quite that we don't have DNA. We, for example, for our study that we published in 2017, we looked at 150 mummies, and more than 100 of them had DNA preserved, which we're kind of really excited about. But then we found that there's so much contamination in the mummies. We think it has something to do with the mummification process itself. Because if you think about how do you make a mummy, you actually take the body and you put it in natron salt, which basically sucks out all the juices, which makes it basically like dry. But then you take it out and you put the next body in because you never recycle the salt because it's very expensive stuff. So basically you have hundreds, maybe even thousands of bodies that are kind of basically recycled in the same kind of natron salt where all the juices are coming out and mixing together. And that probably just makes the samples contaminating each other, the individuals contaminating each other, because what we see is basically DNA from similar times. It's ancient DNA that contaminates it, but we have the DNA of multiple people and a lot of those samples, which makes it very, very difficult. And everyone seems to have that problem. So everywhere that I talk to colleagues, they say, yeah, it was heavily contaminated, our samples. And that makes it very difficult. There's very few genomes we now have, even though there's a lot of bodies, which is a shame because it's such a fantastic place with such a rich history. But we do have now genomes from many places in North Africa, from the Maghreb region, so Morocco, from Tunisia, from Algeria, that basically span from 15,000 years ago, so late Ice Age, until the last few thousand years. And we do see, as we talked before, that there is gene flow starting about 20,000 years ago. You have a DNA signature, which we would kind of find before in the Near East, which we find in Natufians, which is a hunter-gatherer population, late hunter-gatherer population of the Near East. So those are the people that become sedentary. They're hunting and gathering, but they start to stay at the same space for quite some time. They start to make flour. They probably make bread. And they collect wild cereals. They haven't domesticated them yet, but they kind of use them to make flour and make bread.
They are like the farmers before farmers.
Exactly. It's like, it's also not, one day to the other people are like, oh, let's do farming. It is a process that takes several thousand years. They start to kind of, probably then they observe, if some of the grains kind of fall somewhere on the ground, then kind of, sprouts are coming out, and then, we can harvest them. And then if we're staying at the same place, we probably come up with the idea like, why don't we take like half of our harvest and just like let it grow, and then we get like 5 times more and increase. And I think it's straightforward to come up with ideas. Still has taken quite some time. And this population moves also into North Africa and mixes with the local population, with this population we just found from the Green Sahara. And then you have this mixed population, which are the hunter-gatherers of North Africa until 8,000 years ago when farming comes. And now what people have found, at least in Morocco, is that farming actually first comes from Iberia. It does not come from the Near East through basically North Africa into the Maghreb region. It actually first seems to come from Iberia. But then a bit later, just 7,000 years ago, you also have it coming in from the southern Mediterranean. So you basically have two streams of farmer ancestry mixing with the local hunter-gatherer population. But unlike in Europe, where we actually have farmers coming in and largely replacing the hunter-gatherers. In Northern Africa, they mix together. So it's more like a 50-50 mixture.
Oh, interesting. Well, this is really important because like to zoom out a little bit, this process of agriculture being invented and then it's spreading. This happens in many, many parts of the world. And none of them look exactly alike, but one of the biggest questions in understanding this second half of the human story, this Holocene part, this agricultural part of the human story, is the question of how does farming spread? And the big kind of question is how much does it spread as an idea? Oh, this is a great idea, so the neighbors start doing it too, versus is it just farmers have more kids, they start spreading themselves. And so in Europe, it's pretty much farmers coming in and replacing the hunter-gatherers. They get the blue eyes from the hunter-gatherers, right? Like we discussed last time. But so there's a little bit of that mixture, but not that much. And you said there's much more of mixing of people, but it's still the people bringing in farming. It's not that the hunter-gatherers say, oh, that's a cool way of living, but it is still a migration of people, am I right? So both in Europe and in North Africa, the farming from Middle East comes with people, is that right?
Yes, it's just that the mixture components are different. So there is less of a genetic component arriving in North Africa. And in Europe, we also have it in different proportions. So in Central Europe, the early farmers, the first people having farming in Europe, Central Europe, they are 100% Anatolian. They just came in from the Near East. They brought farming to Central Europe. Over the next couple of thousand years, so starting about 7,500 years ago until about 5,000 years ago, they mix a bit with the local hunter-gatherers. They're not replacing them. They're basically still there. They interact. Over time, they become one. But the majority genetic signature would still be Anatolian farmers coming in. But in Northern Europe, it's different. Northern Europe, more than 50%, some populations in the Baltics, it's like 70, 80% of the genetic ancestry is hunter-gatherer, even though they have transitioned to farming. And that's also the case in some other parts in Southern Europe. So you have different mixture proportions. And it's also a process that takes 3,000, 4,000 years. So farmers come in starting 8,000 years ago, and then they kind of come to different places in Europe, and they come first to Central Europe and to Southern Europe, and then later on to Northern Europe, which some people think has something to do with the phenotype, kind of the adaptation that is necessary, because what's quite interesting is that the first farmers, when they come in, and the hunter-gatherers that lived here before, as we talked a little bit last time, phenotypically, they have dark skin.
Blue eyes, but dark skin, yeah.
But also the early farmers, like the Iceman, for example, that lived 5,500 years ago, we just reconstructed his genome. He still has pretty dark skin. He has much darker skin than any European today. And the really light skin color only really spreads starting about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. And we think this is just a response to becoming farmers in Europe, because Europe is so far north, so far away from the equator, especially in the winter, you don't have a lot of light exposure. There's not a lot of sunlight. And you need sunlight to produce vitamin D in your skin. If you have dark skin, you have less light coming through the skin.
Oh, but isn't there an important addition? You need either sunlight or fish.
Or exactly, that's what I just wanted to say. If you eat fish and meat like hunter-gatherers, it's fine. You can basically compensate for it with your diet. So, for example, Inuit living in northern Canada, they have dark skin relatively. They're not like as dark as sub-Saharan Africans, but darker than, say, Scandinavians. But Scandinavia is also the point or the place in the world that is the furthest away from the equator, where people do agriculture. And it took also about 2,000 years when the first farmers come to Europe, before they expand into Scandinavia, before they expand into Scotland, into Ireland. All those northern places get actually settled by farmers pretty late, because we think that they first needed to adapt. They had to get lighter skin, because with the darker skin, they had vitamin D deficiency in the winters. So it's just not a good place to live. If you have light skin, you can still produce enough vitamin D, even though you don't eat a lot of fish and meat, because the early farmers, they were almost completely vegetarian. If you look at their isotope signatures, stable isotopes, and look at their trophic level, they look like vegetarians. They don't really look like carnivores, like hunter-gatherers often do. So they have changed their diet, but then they had to become light. So it's really an artifact of geography that Scandinavians are so light-skinned, and of their culture that is agriculture. Before they had agriculture, they were actually dark-skinned, which is also something a lot of people have a hard time to imagine. If you think about, your fellow Finnish or, other Scandinavian populations, if you go back 6,000 or 7,000 years, everyone has dark skin, like in sub-Saharan Africa. It's really hard to imagine, but that's kind of what our data currently suggests.
And another important part of that story, if we stay in Europe for a moment, is that looking at Europe and looking at Africa, it's very clear that agriculture spreads with people. What kind of agriculture is another question. You mentioned that the European hunter-gatherers are pretty much vegetarians, but they're not vegans because they would have a B12 deficiency. They have animal protein from, what are they using? What, cheese, milk? But that suggests that what the kind of agriculture that spreads to Europe is very different. That's if we would look at, for example, agricultural spreading in the Americas, where you don't have that much livestock. So would it be right to say that there's a package spreading from the Middle East, which is both wheat, barley, this kind of large seeded grasses, and animals that are domesticated, not exactly the same time, but pretty much at the same time, which allows this kind of vegetarian but not vegan diet to spread far, where it's pretty much bread and cheese. Would that be an accurate summary?
Yes, perfect. So we have 3 early domesticates, which are goats, sheep, and cows. They first get domesticated, probably goats and sheep a bit before cows, and they spread as a package with the first farmers to Europe. Pigs actually come a bit later. And you have in pigs actually also, like in cows to some extent, but not as much, also a bit of local admixture with the wild boars basically that are around. And you have a little bit of our ox in early cows, but not much. So even into Africa, I just talked about the Green Sahara people, they themselves had cows. They were actually pastoralists. They were shepherds, but genetically they were African. But in Europe, it really comes as a package with people. They bring them along. So they have animal proteins from milk, so dairy products, but to a smaller extent. And they don't seem to eat their domestic animals. Unlike today, when we think about a farmer, he eats a sausage and lots of pork, and it's a much more kind of meat-rich diet. But actually, farmers didn't do that because they needed the dairy, or they needed the oxen also for kind of pulling the plow, because horses were not domesticated for another 3,000-4,000 years. The horses come in a bit later, and pigs were also not around. So they really use them not as much for meat, but mostly for milk production. Which is then the animal diet that they have. But it's a smaller component compared to the plant-based protein that they mostly eat.
Well, then the Americas, agriculture does also take hold independently in the Americas, a little bit later, but it does. There, the story, based on my current impression, is very, very different than the Middle Eastern farming spreading westwards. Because there, for example, if you look at maize, corn spreading, it seems to spread from the Central America, where Aztecs and Mayas are doing their thing way later, all the way to the Andes, where the Incas are doing their thing way later. It spreads relatively fast, and I haven't seen any suggestion that there was a mass migration of people across the Central America and all the way to the Andes. So my impression that this is a very different story, where first of all it spreads much more as culture rather than as people. So neighbors doing something cool with this corn thing, let's do it too. And also because there's not that many animal domesticates, if any, at that time. Hunting and fishing seems to stay a bigger part of their lifestyle. How much data do we have to support or reject that kind of high-level impression that I have, for whatever reason, developed?
Yeah, so the main domesticate of the Americas indeed are plants. It's not animals. I mean, there are a few animals like guinea pigs or llamas, but that comes, quite a bit later. Turkey also, which is even later. But this is not really, big part of the diet. I mean, later on, some places it is, there's like some high Andes population eat a lot of guinea pigs or have a lot of llamas and vicuñas and guanacos and like various species. But the kind of domestication is mostly on plants, and maize is really, say, early on at least 90%. Then of course there comes tomatoes, potatoes, lots of different legumes that we like to eat a lot. Actually, most of the German cuisine is actually from the Americas, which we Germans are so proud of. But if you actually look at it, I think except of the cabbage, I think almost everything comes from outside Europe. So this is gradual, and we see basically the domestication of the wild cereal, which is teosinte, which is basically what becomes maize.
Which looks nothing like maize, by the way.
It's like, I think no one would ever recognize it as being the original wild type maize, because it looks like a little grass with like 3, 4, 5 little kernels.
Yeah, from Teosinte to popcorn, there's quite a lot of steps of evolution and cooking.
Exactly. So it takes some time. It takes also some time to actually generate a plant that is super productive. Like wheat actually early on is already quite productive because it doesn't look so different. The emmer, kind of like the wild grasses, they're not so different to what becomes wheat and barley at the end. But here, maize actually takes several thousand years. We see that basically on findings in archaeology. There's also genetic data that shows the different genes kind of coming up, some of them a bit earlier, some of them a bit later. It's really a process that takes, several thousand years before we have something that we would say, oh, this is maize. This is like, that looks like, what we know as corn. So probably because of that, it takes some more time. It's more gradual. Kind of neighbors might have some kind of new type that they're kind of growing, but mostly we're still hunting and gathering. So it really takes some time before kind of large civilizations emerge that do mass, basically, production of maize, which takes until about 3,000-4,000 years ago, where you then really have this larger population expansion, which is also part of the Neolithic process, as you said, happens in many places in the world, which in itself I find incredibly interesting, that we have at least 5 places in the world, maybe up to 9 places in the world, where independent of each other, domestication starts, animals or plants. And this is something, it did not happen before in human history. 7 million years, we didn't domesticate anything as far as we know. We started with dogs a bit earlier, we think about 15,000 years ago. But then again, until 15,000 years ago, no one did any attempt for domesticating anything as far as we know. And then suddenly, everywhere in the world, people are doing the same thing. So I think there needs to be 2 things. First of all, you have the Holocene, as you described it. You have a time period that is pretty stable. You don't have a lot of climatic fluctuation, don't have a small ice age coming in again and destroying your harvest or something like that. So it's kind of stability. But I think it also needs some sort of biological change in us, either larger population sizes or something that we suddenly have that gave us the ability to leave Africa in such a short time, to settle all places in the world, some kind of ability to have cultural innovation somehow, yeah?
Or aliens.
Always possible.
I have a past guest who thinks that it had to do with climate change only, but a different kind of climate change that is often discussed. So Andrea Matranga, he has a model where he suggests, he's actually an economist and not an archaeologist, but his suggestion was that what happened with the Holocene was not just that you get stability year to year, you do get that, but in certain areas of the world, you start having much less stability winter to summer. So the Holocene actually has much bigger variations between summer and winter, and that's a big problem for hunter-gatherers who don't store food.
Yeah.
And so his story is that in these areas where you have more winter to summer fluctuations, you start having sedentism where people can store food for the winter or the post-monsoon, pre-monsoon drought or whatever. And lo and behold, those are the places where you find agriculture, and you don't find it in places like Australia, South Africa, which are places where you don't end up having basically on the far away from the equator to the south, you don't have this climate fluctuations winter to summer. So that's quite a neat model. I don't know if you've taken a look at it. Have you heard about it? Do you have any thoughts on it? Or
I think it works. I mean, we also have domestication of like banana, for example, in Papua New Guinea, where I think it wouldn't work. And I think there's also, I think there is some fluctuation in East Asia, but then say rice, for example, gets domesticated in places that are, I would say, a bit more stable. Not that you have really harsh winters and it's pretty much wet the whole year. First, when it was domesticated, it wasn't used in rice paddies as we know them today, like in water. So you don't necessarily needed water. It was more like a cereal that was grown, as far as we know. Yeah, I don't know if it works everywhere, but I think it could be a big part of it, right? So there's several components, but like I'm a strong opponent of the idea that there also needs to be some sort of, let's call it, mutation or genetic shift or change that happened, of course, before we left Africa, because Africans have it in common. They also invented agriculture in the Bantu expansion somewhere in West Africa 5,000 to 6,000 years ago.
Which Bantu expansion would be a perfect example, by the way, of agriculture spreading very much with people, bringing the language, bringing the crops, bringing the culture.
I mean, it's the same in East Asia, same in Europe, same in the Pacific. Most of the time, in almost all of the cases, we see that agriculture spreads with people. There's actually exceptions, like we just talked about in the Sahara, where it seems to have spread culturally. but in most of the places it really spreads with people. And in the Americas, exactly, it is also a change. It's also different. We should say in America, I think there's a lot of exchange because we see then also tomatoes, potatoes popping up, Mesoamerica, and there's some exchange with the Andes, also then with maize. Maize is originating in Mesoamerica, but then basically spreads into South America. But there is some exchange, and it's a longer process. But yeah, it's more stability. It's not like a lot of people moving.
But most of the time, you say what the genetics have given us is it's not that every single time farming spreads, it's going to be with people, but it's pretty much the big picture. It's farmers moving rather than ideas.
And it's, I think, also the main trigger that causes this, what we observe, migrations, is not necessarily people wanting to move to Central Europe because they heard it's such a nice place and there's all these beautiful forests. It's more like, people have a farm, they have 5 kids, they want to build their own farm because there's not enough space on the farm. So they move like 5 kilometers stream upward. And then eventually the populations expand because the population starts at the beginning of the Neolithic. You produce food for the first time in human history. Before we gathered it, so nature produced it, but now we produce it. And we have a surplus of food that we can basically feed to our offspring, which means our population is growing. So from, maybe 1 million or 2 million people 10,000 years ago, we start spreading to the 8 billion people we're on the planet today. We are all basically a product today of the Neolithic, of this agricultural revolution, because that's what we eat, right?
You say that we start growing and the numbers start growing, but what's really interesting is that the human stature, if you don't count the last 100 years, which has been tremendous for human heights, but it shrinks, right? In most places, from being hunter-gatherer to being a farmer. So would it be right to say that we traded some kind of calorific stability for a lot of micronutrient deficiencies? Earlier we talked about vitamin D and vitamin B very briefly, but generally speaking, it's not that people suddenly have an abundance of everything, but they do seem to have an abundance of the bare basics for you to be able to have more kids and spread.
Yes, I think it has all kind of consequences that we become mostly carbohydrate addicted in our diet, because that's what most of the plant diet is for. It's mostly carbohydrate rich food that we start eating, like wheat or barley or corn or rice, which is a wonderful energy source, but it's also deficient in certain nutrients. You can't just live on rice. You cannot just live on barley or wheat. And that actually causes some health problems. I mean, first of all, the sugars are actually a problem for the teeth. We actually see that the teeth are getting really bad. So if you have hunter-gatherers, they usually have beautiful teeth, even if they're old individuals. If you have early farmers, they have crappy teeth with lots of caries. So it's just a product of too much sugar, I think. And then the other problem is indeed the stature gets shorter. So probably there's some malnutrition if you're just like mostly relying on the same type of food. I've just been recently in New Zealand, and people there eat sweet potato basically for hundreds of years. They eat nothing else, right? And all kind of problems, and also in kind of paleopathologies with that, because you're deficient to some degree, right? So it is something that is important to have maybe a bit more of a mixed diet. At least that's what we did for 7 million years. That's how we evolved, right? It's a very, very mixed diet with probably hundreds of different protein sources, until now changing to like 3 or 4, and maybe a little bit of meat from time to time. So that was probably not the wisest. It also brought in diabetes and obesity in kind of later time periods after the Industrial Revolution, where we then had mass production of carbohydrates.
Though I do want to say, just when we do discuss this, because it's so common for people to hear and romanticize diets before ultra-processed foods. I mean, the data is pretty clear that it's been a net positive tremendously for the majority of humans. What's happened, not in the early stage of the Industrial Revolution, but you look at the heights anywhere from, whether it's Europe, whether it's Africa, wherever you look, and it's been insane how much we are literally bigger now than we were 200 years ago.
No, absolutely. That has also changed and shifted, and we have such a surplus of food today that we can choose from.
Yeah. And we can be vegan and be very, very healthy by supplementing the few things that you don't get from a vegan diet. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's not a problem. And I think no one wants to live paleo diet, really. I mean, you always get this idea of paleo diet. You eat like nice steaks and then a little bit of like veggies or something like that. When I see those pictures and you kind of just Google paleo diet, you get a picture. None of the products you see is actually a hunter-gatherer food that they would have collected. Everything is a domestic product. Everything is post-Neolithic. It's like cows that have been domesticated. It's like certain kind of cabbages and squash and what have you, but it's all domesticated. Like none of that is like the type of food you would have had to gather, eating fern roots, eating certain wild animals with a lot of bones, very little fat, very dry meat. I think we probably would starve within a couple of weeks if we would have to eat snails and spiders and...
Yeah, in the conversation with Andrea Matranga that I mentioned about, he actually told a really fun anecdote, which I shared just recently in another episode, but I'm just going to put it here again, which is that there was a population between Denmark and Sweden that for 2 months of the year only ate oysters. Hunter-gatherer population, because there was nothing else in the winter. So that was probably started to be a bit tough on the palate.
Yeah.
But hey, this is, I think, a great overview of how agriculture changes our diets, how it changes how it spreads. Because of course, the typical answer, someone would say, well, why does it spread if it's such a bad idea? It spreads because the farmers are spreading, not because the hunter-gatherers say, oh, that's a great idea. We do have to explain why few hunter-gatherers make the transition, and as we discussed, that might have to do with climate change, might have to do with food storage, sedentism, population pressure, who knows. But anyway, there are other important questions that have to do with the Neolithic revolution, the beginning of agriculture, which are not so much about how the map changes, but how the day-to-day life of people changes. Jared Diamond famously said that agriculture might have been the worst mistake in the history of human race. He was actually talking quite a lot about this pathology stuff, these diseases, the shorter stature, but he does also mention things like increased hierarchies, increase, war, slavery on the scale that we have become familiar with them in history, that this is all has to do with food surplus, because the more you have food surplus, the more one person can be like, well, that's mine. What do you think genetics can tell us, if anything, about the social changes that happen when people settle down and start farming?
So we can, for example, look at social structures, like how a family is organized. So we sometimes have cemeteries, lots of individuals, like from the early Neolithic on, that were all buried within a kind of small context we would call a cemetery. And then we can kind of look at their DNA and kind of see how they actually fit together and reconstruct families. And we've just done that a couple of years ago from a site in France, from an early Neolithic site, Gourgy, where we had more than 100 individuals. And then we can see how this society was organized. And what we find, which is related to what you just described, is almost throughout all of the Neolithic, we see something we call patrilocality. So what we see is that we have male lineages. We have some founding father and his sons and his grandsons and grand-grandsons. But all the females we have, the mothers of those sons and grandsons, they're coming from other communities. So the men stay put, probably on the farm, probably they're kind of stay in the little houses, probably farmsteads, which like maximum 20 people living at one point in time. So the men stay, the women basically come in. So there's kind of marriage networks. This is actually a problem for, if there's some kind of birth of inequality, then that's actually that point, because hunter-gatherer societies today, and probably in the past, are pretty much egalitarian. They don't really have hierarchies, and also they're pretty equal in terms of rights for men and women. They have different tasks to do, but it's not, they are part of decision making.
Yeah, 100%. I've done episodes on this. I mean, it sounds like one of those myths that is probably worth busting, and there are details that maybe should be busted. But yeah, no, it's surprisingly, the more I looked at the topic, the more I'm like, oh my God, this is true. Yeah, especially talking about mobile hunter-gatherers, when you have these weird, almost farmer-looking hunter-gatherers who like store fish for the winter or something, and they end up having often a little bit more farmer-like dynamic.
Yes.
And you have farmers who buck the trend, but yeah, the big picture, yeah, I'm 100% with that. It's do you think this is the same thing as the famous, well, within genetics, the famous Y chromosome bottlenecks? So there's something really weird which happens, not at the very beginning of agriculture, but some millennia after it, especially in Eurasia, which is called the Y chromosome bottleneck. What is it, and is this related?
So this is something I think that is indeed has something to do with later time periods when more hierarchies kind of emerge. So in the early farmer settlements that we looked at, we have very classical monogamic relationships. We don't have polygamy. We don't really see that the same father has children with like 5 different women or something like that. It's small families. It doesn't even seem that when the father dies that the female moves into another family or something. That we see later on in steppe populations where the actually stepsons or the brothers inherit, basically, if you want, which is, one shouldn't say anyone inherits people, but that's kind of like they then have children with the brothers or with the stepsons. Which is something that was practiced until the early 20th century, but in steppe populations.
Steppe populations, so like the grasslands between Eastern Europe and Western China.
Mongolia, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's different there than here. But this Y chromosome bottleneck is something that I think we haven't really understood. It's an empirical observation that the diversity of Y chromosomes shrinks about 7,000 to about 5,000 years ago.
Meaning the amount of male gene become smaller and smaller, and the easiest. I've seen many explanations to this, but by far the easiest is that you start having these harem style, one man monopolizes a lot of women.
Exactly. We have in the Bronze Age suddenly like bands of people with the same Y chromosome. So we can't really say that they're all brothers, but they tend to all have the same Y chromosome. There's some founding fathers of those kind of steppe populations that start expanding around 5,000 years ago, a lot from Eastern Europe into Central Europe.
Oh yeah, we have to talk about this actually, because it's so easy to talk about this whole thing. We mentioned pastoralism and shepherds a couple of times, but in the more I've read world history, more I'm like, this is like the engine of history in especially Eurasia. Is the steppe is not farmers but pastoralists who don't farm food but who grow animals that turn grass into human energy, both energy in terms of meat, milk, but also energy in terms of fast movement, power.
Yes.
And that combination of using grass to get energy have given us the Mongolian Empire, of course, most famously, but it has also given one of the most epic stories in the deep prehistory that genetics has helped us decode, which is the spread of the Indo-European languages, right? So what would be your, I know some of the details we're still trying to work out, but for me, that's been one of the greatest kind of science stories of my life, has been to see this whole thing being parsed together.
It's probably also the biggest contribution of genetics to prehistory, because it was mostly discovered by genetics. So people knew about the Neolithic from archaeology, about the expansion of people from Anatolia. This hypothesis was around. But then we also looked at what happened afterwards. If there was still migrations into Europe, and suddenly there was this big, major migration, big genetic shift that even connected Europeans to Native Americans, out of all things, which was like, why is this happening? Why are suddenly Europeans connected to Native Americans? But it all has something to do with the steppe, with this kind of steppe belt you mentioned that ranges all the way from Eastern Europe to Mongolia to East Asia. This is like one large corridor that was a place where a lot of groups that started then pastoralism. So as you explained, they were then depending on animal herds. They become really mobile, especially from 4,000 years ago when they domesticated horses.
Yeah, and that's really important, the mobility. I didn't mention it properly, because farmers they have to stay in one place more than the nomadic hunter-gatherers. This is the opposite. The pastoralists, they start moving more.
They have to, exactly.
But with a lot of movable property that's easy to steal. So there's also a big premium on being a fierce guy who no one will steal my flock.
No, exactly. And those groups start expanding about 5,000 years ago from the east in Europe to the west in Europe, and from the east in Europe to the Altai Mountains in Siberia. So there's a massive expansion of a culture that we call the Yamnaya culture, which is in what's today southern Russia, so north of the Black Sea, in the so-called Pontic steppe, which is a very good steppe for pastoralism. It's a big meadow that some culture starts to dominate, and then their culture, for some reasons, as you just mentioned, being mobile, kind of expanding in different directions, expands out of this area and then comes to Europe and comes into Asia, completely overturning the genetic signature of the people.
Especially the male side of it, right?
Exactly. It's much more driven by males. You have about 7 times more males than females moving, that we can see in the kind of genetic signature on the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. So we have an almost complete turnover of the Y chromosome within 100 years. Say in Great Britain, where there were farming since 6,000 years ago. There's farming, and then about 5,000 years ago, you have then starting. So I think it's finished about 4,500 years ago. You have the so-called bell beakers. You have this population coming in that derives their ancestry largely from the steppe. And within 150 years, they completely turn over the Y chromosome. So the guys that were living in the Great Britain as farmers don't have offspring anymore.
The Stonehenge builders don't have, but
Exactly.
the so-called Celts or whatever we want to
The
call
people
this,
that started building Stonehenge, they don't have offspring anymore. But then the people that finished Stonehenge, which is actually bell beakers, they finished it.
Oh, really? Oh, I
It's
see.
kind of built over some time, so they're also kind of continuing to build it, which in itself is kind of crazy if you think about it. This is kind of cool place. Let's kind of put in some more stones, you know. And those people, they are this kind of steppe population derived. They have different types of Y chromosomes, so we can detect it.
And they go to India, and they go to Western China.
They go to India. They go to the Altai Mountains. They go to all over Central Asia. They expand a little bit, but just a tiny little bit also into Anatolia, but not so much. But basically connect genetically Great Britain and northern India and China.
And not only genetically, of course, here's the plot twist, but linguistically.
Yes.
We've lost the Indo-European language spoken in Xinjiang in Western China, but we haven't lost the Indian ones, which is what I, as a Finn, who's so speaking one of the very few non-Indo-European languages in Europe, I always say to people who ask, like, is Finnish close to Swedish? I'm like, Finnish is further from Swedish than Sanskrit, or Hindi is from Swedish.
Yes. No, exactly.
Which is, by the way, a mystery of why we don't speak, because there's a lot of the same genetics in Finland. So I've never been able to solve the puzzle.
There's its own kind of hypothesis, and I think Finland is Finno-Ugric languages in itself. It's probably a group of languages that was spoken in kind of northeastern Europe, you know, before even the Indo-Europeans arrived there. But then there's also immigration from Siberia. So Sami, for example, early Sami that we have analyzed have a component that is more Siberian. So there's probably some gene flow there. So Sami is actually close to Finnish. It's also close to Estonian, obviously, which are the three kind of Finno-Ugric languages in this part of Europe that are spoken, which probably came in. But probably there was a Finno-Ugric language spoken there before, but that we do not know.
Okay, so basically with Finland, it all gets really messy. So let's forget about Finland and focus on this very, very crisp and clear story.
Yeah, so Indo-Europeans is a bit more crisp and clear because we also have historical sources of those languages. Finno-Ugric, we don't go back then, you know, more than 1,000 years, but we have Greek, we have Latin, we have Hittite, which is 3,600 years old and is an Indo-European language, and we have it. We can decipher it, we can read it. There's ancient Greek, so kind of late Minoan or Linear B. So there is basically also this fossil languages that we can compare with the modern languages, and then we can also build called phylogenies, like basically family trees of the languages. And then we see they almost perfectly correlate with the genetic signature coming from the steppe. So this is also something that we basically found over the last 10 years. Wherever we look, where people have this steppe signature of this Yamnaya expansion, we also have Indo-European languages spoken. So northern India, actually the Xinjiang, like the western part of China, you had Tocharian. So that was also, which is also an Indo-European language, was spoken there until in medieval time. And then, of course, you have Scandinavia, you have British Isles, Iberia, and so forth, which in itself is also very important because you talk about the outliers, you talk about the languages that are not Indo-European. Finno-Ugric, again, probably came in a bit later from Siberia, but again, we're not 100% sure if that's how it happened. But there's other languages that are non-European in Europe. There's Hungarian, which we pretty much know came in the 9th century from the Ural region. So I think this is genetically pretty much established now and also historically. But then we have other weird things. We have, for example, Paleosardo. So in Sardinia, they spoke a language until Roman time, which was really weird.
And is that just because the Sardinians, the Indo-European expansion, it never reached Sardinia? They didn't take the boats.
That is the idea. If we look at the places where we find non-Indo-European languages, Sardinia, Basque in northern Spain, then we have Etruscan in Italy, and we have Minoan, Linear A. Those are all non-Indo-European languages. We are certain of that, but we can't really read them because we don't have any proxy today, except of Basque, which is still around. The other ones are not around. But we think they are basically one language group of the language that was spoken before the Indo-Europeans came.
By the farmers. So this is the three layers of Europe. You have the dark-skinned hunter-gatherers, you have the Middle Eastern farmers, and then you have the steppe expansion.
Exactly. And that means that Basque is actually the last spoken language of the early farmers, right? So if you think about how early farmers spoke, Basque is the closest, but it's like 6,000, 7,000 years removed from the others. It doesn't really help us. It doesn't help us to read Etruscan. It doesn't help us to know what Paleozoic was like. It doesn't help us to decipher Linear A, which is the Minoan language, where we have writing, but we can't read it because the language is not around anymore. Basque would be the closest key, but it's probably too far removed that we could read it because, say, Dutch and German, they're only like 1,500 years apart from each other, but still, I don't speak perfect Dutch, right? But if you think about something as 6,000, like Sanskrit is like, I mean, you know.
You need a linguist to tell that that's closer to Swedish than Finnish is to Swedish.
Yes, exactly. You wouldn't hear that if you're in northern India.
But I mean, I'm happy that we've talked about the steppe. I think that, I mean, it's really remarkable. You have the Yamnaya in the European expansion from there. You have the Mongolian Empire from there. But if you just take the whole of these horse riding, grass based human populations, it's remarkable. If you look at the time when Europeans start spreading in the early modern times, and you look at, so before the big European sea empires, and you look at the big empires, you have the Qing dynasty in China is by the Manchus, who are like the very, very eastern side of these grasslands. You have the Mughal Empire in India. They are descendants from steppe conquerors, a mix of Turkic and Mongolian steppe conquerors. You have the Ottoman Empire in Turkic, which is another one, comes also from the steppe. The Persians have rulers coming from the steppe at that time. So the world's great empires 400 years ago, so they were all having their roots in these horse riders from the steppe. So it really looks to me just like the engine of history, especially in Eurasia.
Yeah, it's a different type of ocean, right? It's not water, it's grass.
Yeah.
But it is really like that. And they have the ships, which are the horses, and they are really mobile, and they're raiding, as you said, and they have this power. I mean, there's also, it completely changes warfare with the horses, right? I mean, they're like early tanks basically kind of coming in. Like tanks changed complete warfare in the early 20th century. This is happening when the horses are introduced, and you have then horse carts, and you have...
And it happens in America, of course, when the Europeans take the horses there.
Absolutely.
And I think this is one of the explanations also why Africa was so much more difficult to colonize. People often think of Africa as being easy to colonize. It was colonized so late, like so late in the story of colonization. And one of the reasons was that in the northern Africa, they had very good cavalries. And in the southern Africa, they have tsetse flies, which make horses pretty much die when you bring them there. So the cavalry.
It's also jungle, right? It's like also, it's not steppe-like environment, at least in kind of Western Africa.
You needed the machine gun to do the business
Yes.
there. But hey, let's start drawing to a close. I have two final questions. This has been a really epic tour, so I'm very, very sad to have to leave it here, but it's been great.
We didn't even scratch the surface, I feel, of the kind of late
Exactly.
Holocene, right? So there's so much more happening in the last 5,000 years, but
Yeah. But hey, for another time,
for some other time.
two final questions. One is, we've talked a lot about movement, and one of the striking things about the fact that humans have moved as much as we have is that the amount of genetic links between any corner of the world is greater than most lay people imagine, has been kind of my take-home message from reading these genetic studies. We've talked about, for example, earlier of how genes go back to Africa, but then we kind of stopped at North Africa. But of course, some of them do always flow to pretty much everywhere. And so I've been looking at estimates recently of what is the most recent common ancestor. When was the last common ancestor of all humans alive today? And people might think that this is the famous mitochondrial Eve, but it's not. The mitochondrial Eve is a very specific genetic way of thinking about common ancestry, where this particular mitochondrial genome is still with us. But we have many ancestors whose genes we don't carry anymore. And so it's really striking how recent different estimates put the most recent common ancestor of humanity. Now, I know this gets a little bit speculative to put a date on it, but do you want to give your kind of best guess? Because I think this often blowed my mind when I saw how recent the estimates are. When do you think we have the last shared ancestor of all humans alive?
So it's a bit difficult to kind of even know what that is, because it's not one population. It is more like something that we can estimate, right? Like you said, for the mitochondrial DNA, we can estimate the last common ancestor of all mitochondria in the world, which is 200,000 years ago in Africa. We can do that for the Y chromosome. We find 300,000 years. So we call mitochondrial DNA sometimes Eve because it's the female line, Y chromosome, obviously the male line. So we sometimes say Adam and Eve, but then, Adam and Eve lived 100,000 years basically apart from each other, right? Which, is very different. It's very different stories. Then we can estimate the last blood relative of like a continent. People have done that for Europe. Like how closely are Europeans related today? And we actually find that every European is blood related to every European within 1,000 years. So within 1,000 years, we all have, in our pedigree, if I take your pedigree, my pedigree, within 1,000 years, we'll find somewhere a common ancestor. You find it with a person from Spain and Iceland. If you for the whole world, it gets a bit difficult because you have gene flow between Africa and Europe, and then it becomes more kind of like a theoretical than an actual measure. I mean, it is difficult because you have gene flow also from the Near East into South Africa. South Africa has the deepest lineages that we know of, but they had mixed also in the last 200 years with people coming from the Near East, which would have then connected them then also to the Near East. So it's really hard to come up with a population that has been isolated for more than 50,000 years that has not genetically exchanged with their neighboring population. So I do think if you're thinking about a network, I think we would probably find connections to almost everyone within 50,000 years.
But 50,000 years is much more like, because I've heard like 5,000 years sometimes.
It's possible. But there are places like Australian Aborigines, for example, where, of course, then in the 20th century, you have people going there, and then you have links. So it's also depending from where on do you kind of like say that, right? Because the one thing we learned about, genetic history is that people have admixed all the time, and they do that all the time. And people exchange genes whenever they can because, people fall in love, they have babies, whatever. It's all kind of process. Sometimes it's voluntarily, sometimes it's not voluntarily. In many cases, when we look at the Americas, when we look into the Pacific, I think this was not all voluntarily. There you see that the Y chromosomes are gone and just the European Y chromosomes are there. So they're really strange places. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. 5 to 10,000 years is probably possible. The kind of famous 6 connections that you need to be connected to everyone in the world. This is about knowing people. But I think also genetically you would probably be able to kind of calculate something like 5 to 10,000 years. But you have some places that are really remote and have not exchanged so much with other populations. If you calculate the population divergence of all people, you get something that's around 200 to 300,000 years, because Khoisan are actually a very deep lineage.
Yeah, like the Kalahari hunter-gatherers, for example. Yeah.
But then when do you start to introduce mixture processes like the Neolithic expansion, which led all the way from the Near East to South Africa, right? There is 2,000 years ago, the first shepherds with sheep with ancestry that is actually from the Near East arrive in South Africa. They come to Europe, other places, as we just talked about. And that then, of course, connects everyone to everyone, right? Then they are not as distinct. But before that, Khoisan were pretty deep, probably more than 100,000 years. But then still on the fringes of that territory, you would have exchanges with the neighboring regions, which have exchanges with the neighboring regions. And then basically everyone connects to everyone somehow. But it's kind of, there is not the one common ancestor, right? But there's genetic links with all people, of course, over, 10,000s of years, I would say.
Okay, well, final question to all my guests is, how has all your work shaped your outlook on humanity?
Oh, this is a hard one because it's hard to not think about modern day politics, to not kind of look at the situation we're currently in. What we see is our population has exploded. We have 8 billion people. Together with our livestock, humans and their livestock are now 97% of all the mammals on the planet, right? We used to be 0.1% 10,000 years ago when the whole process started. So we are the dominant species. We have destroyed 70% of all basically kind of ecosystems on the planet. And it just gets worse because we're getting more people and resources getting more scarce, and we have all kind of conflicts. So it's really hard to kind of not kind of take that into consideration. We are the most successful mammal. Something in our biology has given us the power, probably our big brain, probably cultural abilities we have, plasticity we have. We live in the jungle, we live on the water, we live in the ice, we live on the high mountains, we live in the deserts. We live pretty much everywhere. We even live in those weird places called cities. What a weird kind of, concrete kind of desert that we're living in, and we managed to live like bees, right? Even though we are horde animals, which you see all the time when two football teams are playing against each other, that we still have this kind of like, spirit for a certain team or something like that. That is part of, I think, our biology. But we have changed that completely. So we are able to do all that, but only to a certain point, and only it was always further, wider, always expanding somewhere. It was always kind of going to the kind of next boundary and then kind of breaking that and then kind of expanding further, which worked pretty well for human history because the planet is big with a lot of places to settle and to expand into. But now we get global boundaries. We're now at a place where kind of like, what's the next, where to go? Some people say space. I strongly believe humanity will never expand into space, except of a few people being shot on a rocket somewhere and then coming back and, probably having some kind of medical deficiencies for the rest of their life. So we will not expand into space. It's a deadly place. No one can live in space. So we have only that one planet. We will never go to another planet outside our solar system. This is impossible. So we're stuck here, and we have to learn to live sustainable, right? And that is the hardest part because it is against our biology. I strongly think this is not what our biology is, because our biology was always expanding, always kind of bigger, better, kind of next level. And now to say, now we stop. This is cool. Like, let's not go further, not advancing, right? So it's a bit hard. We have managed over 50,000 years, and we have had all kind of challenges in the past. And I do think we are very smart. If we can't do it, no one can. But on the other hand, it's surprisingly difficult. I just published a book, which is now also available in English, Hybris, where I describe exactly that hybris that we have, that we do know what is supposed to be done, but we don't do it because we can't. And I think part of that is not just, hybris not doing what should be done, but I think it's part of also our biology, which we can't overcome. But there's also hope at the horizon. We see climate is now a big topic, which, everyone talks about climate change. Sustainability is a big topic. If you build a new house in Germany, it's all kind of like rules that you have to follow now for sustainability. And I think the world is moving in the right direction. So a bit of a question, do we still kind of are able to change it in the right way? And do we live in a Star Trek universe in like 100 years or 200 years? Or do we live both like back in the Stone Age, right? Which is another possibility if, the wrong people make the wrong choices. And then, we have enough weapons to apparently destroy our planet like tenfold into small little pieces or something like that, right? So we can just hope that it's also a peaceful world. And again, it's a bit hard if you look at kind of modern day politics to become too optimistic about the future.
Professor Johannes Krause, thank you for two really, really wonderful conversations, and for your great book, Hybris.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so that was it for today, and that was it for the Origins of Humankind. The series is over. I'm going to take a week off, and in 2 weeks or so, I'll meet you here again for an episode with Agustin Fuentes on the really peculiar and the mysterious world of the biology of sex. Until then, take care.